Okay, and we are live. Thank you both for joining us today on our Anti-Hate Series Part 4. My name is Samia Hassan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. Today we have Evan Balgord and Amira Elghawaby as our guests for our session. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the work of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Allied Nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. In addition to our land acknowledgement, I also wanted to extend our solidarity to what's going on around North America specifically, and we wanted to extend our solidarity to the Black Lives Matter movement and the fight of the Black communities for justice. As a social justice organization, we always condemn all forms of oppression, and we extend our solidarity to our Black brothers and sisters that are fighting oppression every day in their lives. So as I said, today's session will focus on the issue of rising white supremacy with Evan and Amira. And we're also going to be talking about the organizing of the far-right groups and how that's playing out in our society today. So a quick bio of Evan and Amira. So Evan Balgord is the Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and an investigative journalist and researcher covering organized hate in Canada. He is a fellow of the Munk School of Global Affairs, Fellowship in Global Journalism. Before this, Evan was working as a special assistant to Toronto Mayor John Tory. He served as the Vice President of the Canadian Association of Journalists and is non-academic affiliate of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. Thanks, Evan, for being here with us today. Amira Elghawaby is a journalist and a human rights advocate. She's a contributing columnist for the Toronto Star. Amira is involved with several initiatives to promote civic engagement and social cohesion, including as a founding board member of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, as well as a board member of the Silk Road Institute. Between 2012 and 2017, Amira promoted the civil liberties of Canadian Muslims as a human rights officer, and later as a director of communications at the National Council of Canadian Muslims, NCCM. And again, as every week, I don't do justice to the experience of all our panelists, but we will be posting a fuller biography on each of them after the session ends on the comment section. So again, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, this series is part of CASA's ongoing anti-hate work. We do this in collaboration with the Community Leaders Group on anti-hate, and these sessions take place every Tuesday at 4 p.m. And we put them live on Facebook, and also for those individuals that don't have Facebook, we upload them to YouTube afterwards. So because we only have half an hour for these series, we like to get right into it. So I'm going to start. The question is for both of you, so either of you can start with it. So these days we're hearing a lot about the concept of white supremacy. And those of us that are, especially in the activist circle and advocacy circles, we hear a lot about it. But for those of our viewers that are not aware of this concept and don't have much knowledge about it, can you just give us a bit of a background on what white supremacy is, and just give us some current examples of how it's playing out in today's society?
Well, I'll dive right in. Thank you so much, Samia, for you organizing this, to CASA for having these really important conversations. I know last week you did a whole focus on anti-Black racism in Canada, and clearly that is an issue that is on the hearts and minds of all of us right now as we, mourn the tragic loss of George Floyd and others, and including in the context here in Canada as well, with the incident in Toronto, in which now the SIU is investigating. So our hearts go out to the families of those who have lost their loved ones, and to talk about white supremacy in this context, it's very clear that when you have systems in place in which some people, often who are white, who are lighter skinned, who believe that they are superior to other communities, other groups, and have dehumanized other folks, that leads them to act with impunity, to believe that they have the right to commit violence, to essentially execute an individual, as we saw in the case of George Floyd, in front of the public on video, for everyone to see. That is in and of itself an example, a horrific one, of what white supremacy looks like. There are of course many definitions, but it is indeed often associated with those who believe in their superiority of the white race, of superiority of those individuals. They will often espouse ultranationalist, racist, or fascist doctrines, and they often will rely on violence to achieve their goals of a sort of racial purity and whatnot. So white supremacy is, of course, a scourge. Many people will also simply link colonial history, the treatment of Indigenous communities in this country, and again, the subsequent treatment of those communities and other racialized communities, including the Black community, with a straight, direct line to white supremacy.
Evan, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I would say though, many of the groups that we monitor would have people among them that would self-identify as overt white supremacists. A lot of them would not. A lot of it is not always necessarily explicit or overt. It can be systemic, or it can just be, they're not willing to identify themselves as like white supremacists or neo-Nazis, but it's evident in all of their behavior and how they treat members of other communities. So a lot of the groups that we're probably going to jump in and talk a bit about, they wouldn't necessarily identify as being white supremacist, and we're going to use other labels for them, but there is a heavy kind of thread of that runs through their ideologies and their doctrines.
Can you talk a little bit about who these groups are, some of these far-right groups, and what are the movements that are on the rise? And are they all connected to white supremacy, or are there other groups that are involved as well?
Sure. So there's dozens of groups in Canada, and if I were only to focus on perhaps the most concerning ones right now, the top 30 or so, we probably wouldn't have time for that. There's quite a lot of them, but there's three basic movements happening in Canada, and that's kind of a useful level of analysis. So there's the neo-Nazi movement, and within the neo-Nazi movement, there are different types of neo-Nazis. There are, the new alt-right type of neo-Nazis. These are the kids that are getting into it today that use irony. They're online, they're targeting children, trying to recruit other children. And so they're the ones that we've seen the most of and have been most in the media and the news lately. There's also a very scary kind of new type of neo-Nazi that are accelerationists. Basically, that means that they are terrorists. They support using terrorist attacks for their neo-Nazi ideology. And so we know that there are much fewer of those individuals. They're the most extreme of the most extreme. But there's a sufficient number of them in Canada to be concerned about. And even the ones that aren't necessarily part of a formal group, they may have thousands of kind of supporters and sympathizers in Canada. So that's kind of one vein of it. The next vein is the anti-Muslim movement, which was kind of founded around opposing M103. This anti-Muslim movement, though, has demonstrated to be chameleon-like, which means that they kind of change what groups that they target and what issues they care about, depending on the news of the day. So during the Wet'suwet'en solidarity blockades, for example, a lot of their posts and comments would be anti-Indigenous racism. It would suggest, running people over who would be blockading things. So they're kind of chameleons of the issues of the day. And of course, what we're seeing right now with the Floyd protests around the world, in the United States and here in Canada, is a lot of anti-Black racism. and a lot of hatred also directed against their opponents, the anti-racists and anti-fascists and Black Lives Matter. So that's kind of their focus today, but they change depending on what the news of the day is. But first and foremost, they were founded as like an anti-Muslim movement. So that's always the hate that they fall back on. And then finally, we have an anti-LGBTQ plus movement, which is mostly led by street preachers, TERFs, which would be trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And there's a group of kind of Christian-led bigots that will say very hurtful things, mostly towards the trans community, and then will be taken to court and fight in court and make headlines that way. So those are kind of the three movements, the neo-Nazi, anti-Muslim, and anti-LGBTQ plus movements. But of course, even though they might have primary targets, like the neo-Nazis primarily target Jews, the anti-Muslims primarily target Muslims, they'll have all kind of forms of racism within their movements. You know, they'll also target Black and Indigenous Canadians as well, and all the time, not only when it's in the news, but especially when it's in the news.
Amira, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, Amira, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, thank you. I think Evan has really captured it very well. You know, I think for most of us who are not as familiar with these groups, it is actually quite shocking when we start to look at how they are organizing. And that's why I think, you know, the network has been so critical in this work. No one else is monitoring this activity at the moment in Canada. And so as we look deeper and deeper, these trends unfortunately are on the uptick. And certainly the context that we're all enduring right now and experiencing right now is helping to fuel this type of activity, and certainly activities by politicians down south. The President of the United States words are helping to bolster very dangerous activities and narratives in our country.
And can you, so there must be something that is leading to either letting these groups form and organize or contributing to them growing. So are there certain factors that are leading to this rise?
Yeah, I mean, as Amira touched on, what's currently in the news and the rhetoric of political leaders can have a big impact. So when, you know, President Trump, you know, tells the police to kind of like take their gloves off and to go after, you know, their anti-fascist and anti-racist opponents, that would be celebrated by far-right individuals here who, for quite a long time now, since the election of Trump, have actually been calling for like the U.S. to annex Canada, like take over Canada, and at the same time they'll call themselves like ultra Canadian patriots. It's a very weird bunch. But fundamentally, behind kind of racist hate movements, I think the kind of the big takeaway I've had over like 3 or 4 years doing this is the how much they rely on conspiracy theories, right? You can't convince somebody to hate a group of people, of individuals they've never met before, without convincing them that they're some great existential threat. So the conspiracy theories really underpin like that the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to take over Canada with Sharia law. Without that conspiracy theory, it's hard to tell somebody to just go and hate other people. So all these hate groups kind of rely on conspiracy theories, and one conspiracy will lead into another. So once somebody believes one conspiracy theory, it's a lot easier to convince them of the next one, because they already believe that, oh, you can't trust the media, you can't trust what the government says. And once somebody has no trust in institutions and believes kind of any YouTube video they're shown by some other conspiracy theorist, you know, they can get further and further and further and further radicalized into different kinds of hate. So conspiracy theories really underpin a lot of it. But we also have a number of factors here that are kind of specific to Canada. Well, I mean, they might be the same in other countries, but specifically we have a combination of factors here in Canada that have contributed to hate groups acting with impunity. And that's mishandling of hate groups by police. For example, you know, they'll be very friendly to these hate groups during demonstrations, while being a lot more free in how they arrest or curtail the movements of anti-racists who might be there to kind of demonstrate them, for example. And the police almost never investigate or lay charges for online criminal activity, even though like online targeted harassment campaigns and death threats are a serious and a real thing. It's not less real just because it happens behind a computer. But law enforcement is extremely reluctant to pursue things like that. And we don't really have any reasonable legal tools. If we can't get law enforcement to pursue the things that are criminal, and we don't really have any like citizen-driven legal recourses other than maybe individual defamation if one person specifically targets you, we don't really have an avenue to deal with them. So that's kind of a confluence of factors. And then, of course, we also have social media platforms, and this isn't unique to Canada, but we have social media platforms that aren't following Canadian laws. We're not enforcing Canadian law on them. It's in the Canadian Human Rights Act that any company that provides a service or sells a good in Canada needs to provide a service that is free from discrimination. And if you log in on social media, my experience as a white dude is probably very different from your experiences in posts that would target you for hate and racist hate. So they're providing a discriminatory service. They're in violation of our human rights law. We need to enforce that on them and make them pay. So I mean, all these factors kind of come together and create kind of a situation in Canada where we do what we can to expose hate groups, and we had some success in curtailing their activities, but our hands are tied for the worst of the worst ones when they won't change their behavior.
Thank you for highlighting those factors. Amira, do you have anything to add to that before we move to the next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point about the conspiracy theories, you know, is really important, especially right now in the midst of a pandemic, right? So we already know that the ecosystem, that echo chamber of fake information and misinformation is out there. And unfortunately, for instance, we see a lot of misinformation about Asian Canadian communities or Asian American communities. And so that will start also to fuel very dangerous rhetoric and the types of content that people are sharing and the way that they're commenting and really dehumanizing, you know, the communities. These are people that are walking amongst us. And so it is extremely disturbing to see that, but it is very critical to be aware and to be able to, you know, continuously flag that to the social media platforms, even though we know the response is often too tepid, they don't go far enough. But nevertheless, it's really important to make sure that we are holding them as much as we can under the circumstances to account.
Mm-hmm. And why do you can you just explain or spell it out for us why it is dangerous for these groups to be organizing and growing in numbers? What negative impacts can it have on especially racialized communities?
Well, you know, we already know that what is being reported in terms of hate crimes, which is only the tip of the iceberg and is an imperfect system in and of itself, but what is being reported is indicating, you know, that more and more people are being targeted in our communities based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. So there is definitely, you know, a correlation. And again, that's only a snapshot of what's happening. Statistics Canada actually just recently put out a survey on the pandemic that included questions around whether people felt that they had been targeted during this pandemic. And it will be interesting to see, you know, whether or not there has been an uptick there as well. But again, of course, it depends on reporting, and many communities don't even feel comfortable or may not have access to these surveys to begin with. But that being said, we know it's very troubling because these activities can lead to criminal activity, whether it is through hate crimes that are committed, whether it is through organizing. You know, Evan can talk more about how the network has actually disrupted neo-Nazi podcasts, neo-Nazi groups, and held people promoting hate accountable for trying to, for example, as Faith Goldie tried to do, you know, run ads for her campaign when she was running for the mayor, when she is clearly someone who espouses white supremacist, racist views. So the idea here is that by creating an atmosphere where it may seem okay to espouse these views, you have a situation as we had in Quebec City in 2017, where a young man, you know, consumed, and the documents show that he was visiting all of these hateful sites online. He was reading what even politicians like Donald Trump were saying, but, you know, others, Marine Le Pen in France, and further sort of becoming self-radicalized enough to walk into a mosque and shoot 6 men dead. And of course, we have other examples of incel violence, and very sadly, where you have the Toronto van attack and the killing of people in Toronto, by someone who was also radicalized online with, you know, hateful narratives, hateful content, you know, and these communities that are spurring each other on, and pushing each other. And you never know when it will push someone over the edge, and to take such horrific steps towards violence. So absolutely, it is absolutely critical to be monitoring, and simply put, the law enforcement agencies can, you know, are only able to do so much. You know, as our work has demonstrated over the past, you know, we've only hit 2 years in operation at the moment. Our work and investigations supporting, you know, what's law enforcement tried to do has actually helped disrupt. And I'll let Evan sort of elaborate a little bit more on that point.
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, you can't address a problem until you learn what it is and learn the scope of it. And you can't address the problem of kind of specific individuals until you find out who they are. So figuring out who might be behind a username that's creating and spreading some of the worst propaganda is a big part of what we do, and some of the most important stuff we do. Because when we expose somebody for very hateful behavior, propagandist kind of behavior, about 70% of the time, they will either curtail those behaviors because they know that now that they're known, they theoretically could be criminally charged. So they choose to self-censor a bit, or they just disappear altogether because they don't want to face just the social accountability or possible legal accountability of their actions. So when we connect their online actions to their real life identity, a lot of them stop. And those that don't, that remaining 30%, at least we know who they are now. And there's the possibility that, you know, there could be a lawsuit, or we could file what's known as a criminal complaint, which actually isn't a big formal process. It just basically means we go to the cops, we say, here's what this person did, here's all the proof that they did it, here's the law they broke, please charge them. Rarely it works, but it's worth an effort. Now, what we need though from other places like government is we need them to enforce the laws in social media companies. That's a big one, because social media companies right now get away with being a platform for the worst kind of hate propaganda that is literally targeting children to turn them into neo-Nazis. And we need to find the heck out of these social media companies until it can't just be a cost of doing business for them, right? Like, we need to make it so financially punitive for them to host radicalizing hate material that they stop doing it. We also need laws that used to exist in Canada, like Section 13. The short version, Section 13 is basically, if somebody's being like some of the worst kind of hater or racist, and putting that material out there, encouraging people to, you know, do violence towards a group, etc. Any citizen used to be able to file a complaint about that to the Canadian Human Rights Commission /Tribunal, which had judges on it. And then if the judges found, yeah, this person broke that law, they could order them to stop. I mean, it wasn't hugely punitive, but at least it was a faster process. It didn't we didn't have to rely on the police to do investigations, and it worked. Most of the people who were kind of brought before that tribunal and then ordered to stop, stopped, or at least severely curtailed their activities. So it worked. We used to have a recourse for like the worst of the worst ones, right? When just the social accountability wasn't enough. We need that back. That law was taken away, even though it was found to be constitutional multiple times, including by the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, it was removed under the Harper Conservatives because it became this big free speech issue. But we need that law back, because in its absence, we have very little. And the other thing that I think is really important right now in kind of addressing this stuff is the front line right now is schools. It's children. They are being specifically targeted by hate propaganda meant to radicalize them. Where they play video games, where they chat online, they're being targeted by adults and other children trying to radicalize them. So I think getting educational resources and information and training in the hands of teachers and parents will be very helpful in kind of spotting these signs of radicalization so that interventions can happen earlier.
Great. And you both mentioned a couple of times that we don't have the accurate reporting on these kind of things. So where do you think that responsibility lies? Do you think there's a role for organizations like CASA and other not-for-profit organizations or advocacy organizations or organizations that provide settlement services? Because a lot, like you mentioned, people don't necessarily go to the police when they face hate speech or hate crimes. So where do you think that that reporting role could lie?
I think there's actually a fairly easy solution to the issue of that we don't have a good measure of just how bad hate is in Canada, really. It doesn't exist because police reported hate crimes. Stats are very, very bad for a ton of reasons, but basically the long and the short of it is it's maybe like 2% of actual overt hate instances in Canada get reported by the police to Stats Canada. So there's actually a fairly simple solution to this. Every 5 years, Statistics Canada does a portion of a survey in a bigger survey they do every year. And the portion is on victimization, and the bigger survey is,
the general social survey.
Yeah, so simple, like let's repeat that portion of victimization every year. Let's actually believe victims instead of relying on police to tell us exactly what they found and just the ones they believe in and just the ones they know about. That's bad data. We'll just ask people, here's what a hate crime or hate incident is. Have you been the victim of one, right? And then just believe the victims. And then that can be our snapshot. If we just do that every year and make sure that all communities are kind of represented, which means we might need to oversample some communities to get proper sample sizes, yada, yada. But just make sure it's representative of the country and then and different areas. And then we can just do that year over year over year. And we'd be able to figure out, are things getting better or are things getting worse? We'd actually be able to track it, measure it. And what organizations like CASA can do, and many others, is it's one simple ask, talk to your MPs, say, we have no measure of hate in Canada that's actually anything like reliable. There's an easy fix, just make this change. And if we all got together and started saying that, I think that would make a big difference. And we might actually get to a point where we're accurately measuring the thing year after year.
Yeah, and that's interesting you mentioned that's one of our, as part of the anti-hate community leaders group, which the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is part of. That's one of our recommendations. And we spoke to Statistics Canada a couple of days ago as well, and have been kind of pushing for that. So hopefully soon. I know they are putting out another GSS, but it's on social identity in a couple of months. But hopefully for the next victimization survey, they'll incorporate our recommendations. So we don't have too much time left, but I do want to ask one last question before we go. In terms of the role of white allies in the fight against white supremacy, what does that look like, and what recommendation would you have for them?
So I think just in the interest of time, I would really direct the viewers today to go to our website. So it's www.antihate.ca. We actually have, a full page that, provides information on how people can help. It includes helping even in monitoring, reporting what's happening, what's going on. And then just quickly to the point about how do we encourage more people to report. I mean, we know that many communities are not going to go to the police services. Just this passing of Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Toronto really highlights and amplifies the fear that many racialized communities have when interacting with the police. So even local community health centers can become hubs where people may be able to go and report hate. This is actually something we're working on here in Ottawa, to have community hubs where people can report these incidents. And then in terms of white allyship, it really is to be helping in being the eyes and ears to see what's going on. As Evan said, what he sees on social media is very different from what we will see as people of color, as visible minorities. And so white allies have to be alert to what's going on, have to report that. And as I said, please visit our website for more suggestions and ways to support this really critical and urgent work right now.
Evan, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I really appreciate that you've pulled this together. And I'd be excited to actually hear a bit in the future if Stats Canada gets back to you on implementing some of those suggestions.
Yeah, so for sure we're on their case, and I think Amira is in that communication, so she's well aware of everything that's happening there. But that's been slowed down a little bit because of COVID and some of the changing priorities because of it. But we're trying our best to keep the attention and agenda on this issue. So thank you again to Amira and Evan for joining us today. Again, we'll be back next week, and the topic that we've selected for next week is to discuss racism within racialized communities. So how sometimes when we're oppressed, we can also be the oppressors to other communities, and how we can identify our own biases as racialized communities and extend our solidarity to other communities that are oppressed. So tune into that next week. I'm really excited about it. We're having Shri Paratkar and Stephen Zhu as our guests for next week, Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Thank you, Amira and Evan, and hope everybody has a great the rest of their day.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Sam.
you.
Take care.